emergent architecture? Emergent architecture is an idea that's been around for a while, although it's difficult to fully understand emergent architecture. So rather than talk about it conceptually, let me try and show you what emergent architecture is really all about. It's actually much easier and simpler to show than it is to actually try and explain it. So let me do that. Let me do some diagrams on my iPad. I'm not sure if this is going to work or if this is going to work out nicely or not, but let me give it a shot and then we'll see how we go. So let me start from an architectural point of view. Typically what you find is that most organizations will when they create their architecture within the organization, they'll end up with a component-based architecture. And so what is very common is that they'll have perhaps some user interface layer. And in this day and age, it's very common to have a web user interface. And then that web interface may communicate, let's say, across the internet to some back-end services or some back-end servers. Typically, these are some Unix-based service or servers. And then underneath that or supporting that is a business rule layer and also often a messaging layer. Typically, right at the very back end, you'll find some databases. You may have, say, for example, a DB2 COBOL database. You may have an Oracle database. You may have something more modern like a Mongo database or perhaps CouchDB or something very, very similar. But if you take a look at most modern complex environments, you end up with this, or you'll frequently see a complex component-based sort of approach to building out the organization's architecture. And this is typically called a heterogeneous architecture. This is very, very common for many large organizations, many complex businesses. And when these large businesses and these large organizations decide that they want to scale out Scrum throughout their organization, what is very common is that they'll create Scrum teams based around the different components. So it's very common to, say, for example, end up with a web UI Scrum team, a services or Unix Scrum team, and then a business rules or a message MQ Scrum team. And so you end up with these Scrum teams focused around the different components. And if you do that, if that's the approach that you take, then what you'll very quickly find is that it doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is that this is a well-known anti-pattern. So let me try and illustrate why it may not work. If you are, let's say that you're building some services, let's say that you're part of the web UI Scrum team, it's very possible that you can build the most elegant, most wonderful web UI, which isn't supported by the rest of the architecture. It's if you're on the Unix Scrum team, then you could build these wonderful servers and services that no one ever calls from the front end. If you're in the business rules Scrum team, then you can build fantastic business rules that no one ever exercises. So typically what you find is that this is a failure approach to how to scale out Scrum across the organization. And so the next question that often comes up is, well, if this doesn't work, then what is a better approach? What is an approach that does actually work? So Scrum teams will start by building the minimum of the web UI that adds value, that is useful to the organization or to the customer. And so they will start with the minimum. And it could be a very small feature or function in the web UI. But they wouldn't stop there. It wouldn't be just the web UI. Not only that, not only building out the minimum of the web UI, they would also build out the minimum of the services that support that web UI. And then the minimum of the business rules that support the services and the web UI. And the minimum of the messaging layer. And finally, the minimum of the database. Let's say, for example, it's maybe some Oracle, some tables in Oracle perhaps. And you build all of that. And then what you would do is you tie all of that together. And that would be an increment of the product. But that increment in itself may be not terribly useful from a business point of view. It may be important, yes, but it may not be terribly useful from a business point of view. And so why not add to it? Why not add a little bit more to the web user interface? And then for that, the minimum or a little bit more for the services, and then a little bit more for the business rules and the messaging and the for the database. And again, tie all of that together. And the way that Scrum teams will work is by taking lots of vertical slices through the entire hierarchy of their architecture. So you take a vertical slice all the way through and you deliver a little bit of everything for every single increment. Not only the web user interface, but also the services, also the business rules, also the messaging, also the database as well. So you deliver a little bit of that for every single slice. And the way that Scrum teams work is that they take lots of slices through the entire stack of the architecture and they bind it all together. And the way that they bind it all together is using something like continuous integration or continuous deployment. And so the way that Scrum products are created is by taking lots of vertical slices. And the important thing to realize is that each vertical slice is a product backlog item or a user story. And so the way that Scrum teams will work is they'll build lots of vertical slices of product backlog items and then bind it all together with continuous integration. So emergent architecture is the architecture that emerges from the ongoing creation and maintenance of the product that we're working on. There are a couple of things about this that are probably worth pointing out. The very first one is that the end result that you're going to end up with is likely to be very, very different than what you originally planned right at the very beginning. So you may have some idea, you may have some target about where you want to go with your architecture, but you are likely to end up with a very, very different result. And the reason for that is because you're going to accommodate changes as they occur. So you're going to have ongoing changes, and all of those ongoing changes are going to impact the overall architecture of the product. And so you are likely to end up with something that you couldn't quite imagine right at the very start. So let's take a look at emergent architecture from the point of view of user interface. Let's say, for example, a web user interface. There may be some, as part of this web user interface, there may be a window perhaps, maybe it's a browser window, for example. Then on top of that, right at the very top, there may be some, perhaps a room for a banner header. Right at the very bottom, there may be some information that you may need from a legal perspective, maybe some disclaimers perhaps. We may want to collect some data, so we may have some data entry fields. There may be an image over on the right-hand side. We may have some radio buttons. Perhaps there are some options that you can toggle. And there's maybe some checkboxes. Finally, we may have an OK button. And let's just put in a little bit of branding, a little bit of color in our web user interface. So we may, let's say that we have a sun and some waves. I live in Queensland, Australia, and it's always sunny here with lots of waves, and so that's fantastic. So let's say that we do that. So okay, we may find our user interface looks a little bit like this. Okay, so how would Scrum teams do this, or how would Scrum teams build this? Well, the way that Scrum teams will do it is they'll typically find the piece of information that adds the most value. Usually when you take a look at a web user interface, a lot of people assume that everything on the web user interface is important, but that's not actually true. Typically what you find is that there'll be some items that are very, very important, but you'll also find that there are many items that are of little or no value whatsoever. And so what Scrum teams will do is they'll try and identify the highest priority items and deliver those first. So, for example, with car insurance, if you apply for car insurance online, then they're going to ask for all sorts of information. Not all of that information is terribly irrelevant. They'll ask for all sorts of things. They'll ask for your address, your location, your age, your car details, maybe even your occupation. But a lot of that is actually not terribly important. There are, if I remember correctly, only 3 or 4 variables that you actually need in order to quote on car insurance. They include things like your zip. Maybe the date of birth of the driver, I would imagine. I'm not really terribly sure, but it's since it's been a while. But I would imagine date of birth of the driver. What else? Zip. Oh, the make and model of the car. So anyway, not all of the information that you have when you apply for car insurance is terribly irrelevant. Only some items are terribly relevant. In other words, there are items that are more important than others. And the way that Scrum teams will work is they'll try and identify those more important pieces of data and deliver that first. Don't worry about all the other extraneous stuff. They would worry about the information that's most important. So, for example, let's say that we let's say that we have this web user interface. The way that we would build this is that we'd start by trying to identify that highest priority item, the items that, or the data that is the most important. And let's say that it's maybe a couple of text fields, and let's say that we deliver that. And then typically on top of that, the next most important thing is the OK button, because you need to be able to submit that information or do something or process that data in some way. So typically it's maybe a couple of text fields, maybe an OK button, and so we deliver that. Not only would we deliver that, but we'd also deliver all the services behind that as well. So not just the web user interface, but also any business rules, any services, any database structure, whatever we need in order to support those two fields in the OK button. And so we do all of that. And then, of course, that may be useful, but that may not be sufficient in itself. You may then want to add more information on top of that. So let's say that we want to do that. Let's say that we wanted to perhaps collect some checkboxes. Let's say that we do that. So that may be the second increment of our web user interface. So we may then add those checkboxes, and then maybe after that we might want to add a picture perhaps, and let's say that we add that over here. Finally, we may decide that we'd like to add the radio buttons, and so we would add that as the next increment. And again, every time that we add one of these elements, we would also add all the services and data necessary to process all of that. So what we're doing is we're adding all those features and functionality behind each of these different areas of data or pieces of data. And let's say finally we want to add that final checkbox. We may add that there, and then we may want to add the disclaimer, and finally we may want to add our banner ad or our text ad. And so let's say that we've changed our mind. So let's say that we've decided that a stormy cloud works better than a nice sunny day. And so we may finally decide that we would like to have that as our banner ad. And so you may end up with a user interface that looks a little bit like this. So again, a couple of things about this that are quite interesting. The very first thing is that there's, even though we started out with an idea about what we wanted, you may likely find that the end result is going to be different than what you started out with. And that is actually very realistic with emergent architecture. And the reason, again, for that is because Scrum teams will typically react with all the changes that come in. So as changes come into the team, as they build the product and account for any changes or variances that might occur along the way, it impacts the overall structure of their architecture. So you can't necessarily guarantee that what you set out to do, you're going to end up with something that looks identical. You may not. You just simply don't know one way or the other. So the end result may look different than what you originally intended. So that's one thing that's probably worth pointing out. The second thing that's worth pointing out is that the teams will deliver not just the web user interface, but they'll deliver all the features or functionality behind that. And so this is exactly the same idea as when we talked about the very first example, doing those deep vertical slices across the entire architectural stack. Scrum teams will do exactly the same thing when they're building web user interfaces. Let me share with you one final example, which is an example from the point of view of building a report. Let's say that we want to do a report that is perhaps something like a bank statement. On that account statement, we may want to have something like the address, perhaps the bank branch or the brokerage branch or something like that, perhaps on one side, and on the other side, the individual's address, the individual details. You may then have a category. Maybe it's the type of account, perhaps. Maybe you have several accounts and there are different types. So let's say, for example, the account type. And then underneath that, you may have a list of transactions. There may be debit and credit transactions, perhaps. So you may end up with something that looks a little bit like this. And finally, you have the totals on the bottom of it. And so you may find that you need a report that looks a little bit like this. Let me walk you through the way that Scrum teams will typically build this. So the way that they will build it is, of course, by starting with the report, the layout of the report, and you may find that the most important information as part of that report is the customer's information. Many people will say that everything on the bank statement is important, but we know that's not actually true. There are some parts of bank statements that are more important than others. So, for example, the address or the who the bank statement is addressed to is very, very important. Typically, when I open up a bank statement or when I look at when I receive an envelope, the very first thing that I look for is I look for my address. I don't care about my neighbor's bank statement. I care about my bank statement. And so for me personally as the end customer, that's the very, very first thing that I look at. Maybe we should start there. Maybe we should start by addressing just that need. So let's say that we do that. Let's say that we do, the very first thing that we do is the customer's name and address, and also our name and address as well, because you want to show exactly who this bank statement is coming from, perhaps. The very next thing that I look for is not the transactions, not all the different activities that occur, but the bottom line. For me, the bottom line, my name and address and the bottom line, those are the things that I really care about. I don't care about all the different transactions. I just want to make sure that I've got money in my bank account. And so typically I would start by looking at the bottom line. Once I've done that, only then will I go back and take a look at all the details. Only then will I go through and make sure that all the details are correct and that there aren't any transactions that I weren't expecting. And so Scrum teams will build a report in exactly that way. They'll take a look at all the data, find out what's most important, and deliver the most important item soonest. The stuff that isn't quite so important they'll leave to further down. And so Scrum teams will build up reports incrementally, just like they'll build up user interfaces incrementally, just like they'll build up the enterprise architecture incrementally as well. And so this approach to building products incrementally by taking lots of vertical slices throughout the entire stack of our architecture and then doing that over and over and over again on an ongoing consistent basis is called emergent architecture. I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for listening.